So the next job before finishing up these front guards is I want to get the bonnet sorted out, because it's going to be a lot easier to do that without all of this in the way. So I've made a bonnet before. I just didn't do it right the first time, so that's why I'm making a second one. So I've taken the bonnet off here and I have it sitting over here, and I've been marking it up ready to cut out all the little fingers that need to be cut to make this sort of integral hinge work. And these are the bonnet panels I made before. The reason I'm redoing these is because it's a bit hard to see from this angle. This bottom panel needs to be a rectangle, and when I did it, I cut it on an angle, so the hinge line there wasn't running parallel to the ground, it was running up on a slope, which isn't really right. So I've remade the panels, and now I have to remake the side hinge. And as you can see, it's all one piece, well, two pieces. There's the top piece and the bottom piece, and the metal's just cut in a certain way so that it wraps around the hinge pin, and it all just stays together with no fasteners at all. So there's no rivets or screws or anything. It's just a really nice clean line all the way down the side of the bonnet. Obviously the measurements for this are fairly critical, so I modeled it up and I figured out all the measurements exactly to know where you have to cut this and where you have to fold it. So I've marked it up very carefully, and I've blacked in the bits I need to cut out and up to where you need to cut them out. So this is the top, obviously, and you can see the top comes down, curves back around, and then loops. So this is the fold line, and then these fingers will fold back over like that and then come up and loop around the brass pin. So I've marked up both of the new ones, and I've marked them up the same way as the previous one I made, because I may be able to save a little time and reuse these bottom panels. I think there's enough height in this that I can just cut this off. There's probably enough height, but I don't think there'll be enough width, because if you imagine this line is on an angle, it means the ends aren't square. So even if I've got enough height, I don't think I'm going to have enough width to make these bottom panels match the new top one. So I'll probably have to remake the bottoms as well. The bottom also has this added complication of this flange in it, which you can see on here. It has to have this little joggle in it as well, so that when everything's closed, the panels sit flush on the outside. So I was hoping to save some time there, but it looks like I'm not going to. So the next job is cutting all of this out, and that takes quite a while. So you can see now I've started cutting out the little fingers on the edge of the bonnet panels. There's one I haven't finished. The easiest way I've found to do this is to cut the slots first, and then I use the aviation cutters to then cut sort of the triangle out, basically. So you've got the two slots, and then you cut in like that, you get all these little triangular pieces. And to actually cut the slots, I was using the angle grinder with the very thin cut-off wheels. I think these are 1mm. You have to be a bit careful. You don't want the wheel loading up with aluminium too much. But I find these ones don't tend to. It goes through it pretty easily. And then to actually do this cut along the bottom, I've been using these little cutters that I have, which are actually they're used for electronics, for making panels, front panels. And there's just kind of a little shear in there that nibbles down. And these nibblers just take little tiny bites out at a time. You can see the little pieces it cuts out. And I just use that to nibble along the back line until the pieces fall out. next I'll go through and I'll tidy all of this up with a file and go on to the other panels. Now that I've cut all these fingers out of the edge of the aluminium panels, I need to fold them over. And the way I've been doing that is just with a piece of square steel tube clamped to the side of my temporary bench there, and then I just simply hammer the edge over. I've actually been using the dead blow hammer. That makes it really easy and it doesn't mark the aluminium. So I turn the edge over to 90 degrees, and then I've been using my lump of steel that I actually modified in the mill. I sort of milled a 45 on it, so that once I've got that up to 90 degrees, I can use that, fold it down to 45, and then it's easy to fold it all the way over. And to get it all the way down and nice and tight, I've been using my homemade wooden mallet. Just again, because then it doesn't mark the aluminium. So once that's done, you end up with the edge folded back on itself like this. Next I have to remark the lines, because of course lines were on the other side of the panel when I first marked it out. I need to remark the fold lines for each of these, which is where you fold it back up to give you the 90 degree, which is what you then wrap around the brass hinge pin. So I'll do the second one, and then I'll mark these up, and then I'll start bending these up to 90 degrees. So that flange is now up at 90 degrees, and now I'm going to use my little lump of steel with the 45 on it to bend it down to 45 degrees, and then I'll flatten it down. You probably don't really need to use this, but I just find that helps to keep that line really nice and straight and tight. So I'll go ahead and do that now. Should add here, even though it might seem obvious, it probably isn't. When you're doing this hammering, you don't try to hammer the metal in one place all at once. You slowly work backwards and forwards, bending it over a little bit at a time. So you can see here, I've started bending it flat, so it's gone past 45 degrees, but I haven't tried to hammer it all the way down. So in other words, you don't start at this end and hammer that flat and then keep hammering it flat as you go, because you run the risk of distorting the panel or shifting the line, or it's better to go evenly all the way along. So you do multiple passes, bending it over a little bit at a time, and you just keep doing that, and you keep working it backwards and forwards. When I've got it all done really nicely, I tend to use either this dolly or the big round one, and then I just go over the very edge. So I rest that dolly underneath the panel, and then using the wooden mallet just really tighten up that edge nice. So this one's almost finished now. Finished the next step, which was folding the starts of the hinges up 90 degrees. And you can see to do that I used a piece of flat strap along there, just clamped to the table. What I found is I was actually a bit too good when I folded that flange over and flat. I folded it a bit too flat, and it actually makes it quite hard to lift up these little metal tabs. And I found I had to use an old wood chisel to get underneath the corners, and then I was able to use a flat scraper to start lifting them up. Once I had them up far enough, I used the sheet metal pliers here. You can just sort of clamp them onto the panel and use that to fold those little tabs over, and that keeps them all straight, as well as having the bar there, of course. So you don't want that corner in there doesn't have to be very tight. In fact, you don't want it very tight, because if we look at the other one, you can see this is the start of the hinge, and the hinge pin will be a piece of brass like this that sort of goes in there, and this piece of metal has to wrap around this pin. It always looks like there's too much metal there, but once you start wrapping it around, it all sort of fits quite nicely. So this is the reason why that doesn't need to be a nice, really tight 90-degree bend. So the other thing to point out is the reason why you need these little notches here, and that's because of the way these two panels fit together. You need to have the, if we look on the back of this, you need to have the gap there so that the hinge part on the bottom panel has space. Obviously it needs room in there for that little piece of curve. So with those done, I now need to start making up the bottom panels. This place is getting messy again. I have worked out the lower panels and how I'm going to do those, and I've actually done a test piece. So the first thing we need, if we look at this end in this panel, is this joggle, which is where the panel does that little, get to focus on it, the panel does that little step. And the way I do this is just in the bead roller with these sort of stepped die things here, which puts the little kink in the panel. And I've just got a little guide that I made that is just clamped in there, and that allows me to run the edge of the panel, the back edge of the panel, against that guide to give me a really nice straight line there. On the original ones I did it by hand, and the line ended up a little bit wavy, which always annoyed me. But as part of the test, I actually did that fold on the wrong line. You have to allow for that step up, which is about 2 or 3 millimeters. And I actually rolled the line a couple of millimeters short, and you can see where that comes into it. You sort of get how the hinge pin works now. So again, it has those fingers on it, and then it just wraps around the brass pin. And the way this works is, you imagine that basically sits on there like that, and then those other fingers roll around, and that's what locks it all together. And so you can see why you need that joggled edge there, and why the height of it is really important, because you want that line to be nice and even all the way along. So it needs to be something like that. And then this hinge just opens and closes that way. So now I know I've got the measurements pretty much dialed in. I'll go ahead and make the actual panels. This is all set up now to run that joggle. You can see the guide up at the end there that supports that end. One thing I did on this panel was ran the body file all the way along that edge to give me a nice smooth edge to run up against the guide. And the other thing worth noting is I have the pressure on this quite high, so it's cranked down a lot, basically so I can do this joggle in one pass. I found if I try to do multiple passes, sometimes they don't go exactly in the same track, and you end up with a slightly distorted line. So I'm trying to do it all in one hit here. It's quite hard to get the panel to go into the rollers, but once it's in there, it goes through fine. That came out pretty well. So that's given me a really nice, straight, even joggled edge there. That's a lot better than my first attempt, which was over here. Not sure if we can see, but this was the first time I tried it on the original bonnet. It's a bit hard to see, but that line is just not straight. So this one should be a lot better. This is the advantage of having to do things multiple times. You get better at it. Hopefully you get better at it. Hopefully this is the last bonnet I do for this Austin 7. The next one will be the one for the Riley, I guess, if that's the way those bonnets are made. I'm not sure. I'll have to have a look. Now that I've done the one panel, I'm going to go ahead and do the second one. Usually, if I'm doing things in pairs like this, I try to do the same operation on both panels at the same time. So just in case I ended up having to stop now, or I get interrupted, or I have to move something. I know now that this machine is set up exactly right to do these panels, and I know exactly what the measurements are, and I just basically do the same thing again, and then I know I've got two identical panels. Of course, the danger is there that if you do them wrong, you've done them both wrong. But that's one of the reasons I did that little test piece, the little example one, because that was enough for me to know that the measurements are correct and everything's going to work. The other thing I may do while I've got the panels in this state is random orbit sand them. I forgot to do that on the top bonnet panels, but just to get rid of all the scratches and things, and it's a hell of a lot easier to do that when it's all flat like this. The other thing worth noting on these panels is, again, once I've done that, I'll mark them with which side is up and which way the folds have to go, because it's very easy to forget which way up this joggle goes, start marking things out, and then fold things the wrong way. And I actually did that on my test piece. I folded the little fingers up the wrong way and then realized. So that's one of the reasons you do little tests like that, so you know the measurements are correct, and you practice your movements so you know that they're correct as well. Finished the second panel and did notice that the guide in my rollers has actually shifted just slightly. I need to put something on this to stop it sort of tilting backwards and forwards like that. It needs a flat piece on the base. In here, it needs a little flat piece to stop it twisting. And that did make a very slight difference on this panel. You can see it sort of started off on the line up here, and then by the time it got to here, it's gone off a little bit. The line is still straight. If you put the straight edge down it, it's still a straight line. And I can easily compensate for that because the panel is oversized all the way around. So I'm just going to measure this, trim that edge, and the bottom edge has been left deliberately long, as have the sides, because I won't finish off the bottom until I actually get these done and on the car, so I can get the height exactly right. On the last set I did, I just left the bottom as a raw edge, and I'm wondering about actually turning over an edge on these to make it slightly thicker at the bottom and just to finish it off a bit more nicely. That does mean these won't sit hard up against the rubber on the sides of the bonnet, but the bonnet and the sides of the body and the radiator surround. But I don't think that'll matter. It'll just make that bottom edge a lot nicer. And I also have to attach some things to the bottom here. Little finger handles and things like that. So having a double thickness there, I think, will help. I'll fix up the top and I'll start cutting out all the little fingers in this, and then I'll see what I'm going to do when I get to the end. Now that I have all of the panels cut out, this is where the labeling becomes important. So you can see on this one, it's labeled near and near inside. So this is the near side of the car, which is the side closest to the footpath. And it's important to label these bottom panels, especially because of the way this joggle has to go. So it has to step up on the inside like that. The next thing that's important is, the other reason these need to be matched is because they're going to be a match pair. So this will be notched out to match this one. So this panel is still quite a bit oversized width-wise. So I'm just going to put it basically in the middle, and these little fingers are 1.5 inches wide, so I'll just start marking 1.5 inches across these. And then I'll do the same as I did on the tops. I'll mark them out and I'll cut them. This is where using that 1mm cutting disc works really well, because if you just cut them on the Sharpie line, these fingers would clash with the ones on the bottom because they'll be exactly the same width. So even though these are 1.5 inches wide, you actually want them slightly narrower than that, so that the top and the bottom will slide in next to each other. So they're actually slightly narrower. and that 1mm cutting disc does that for you automatically. So I'll mark these up and start cutting them out. So this is all marked out now for cutting, and you have to be really careful doing this. It's so easy to make mistakes, and you can probably see I managed to make a mistake here. I want to be very clear which pieces I'm cutting out, and so I was going in, colouring in the correct squares, and then just you get into a pattern and you stop thinking and you colour in the wrong ones. So I had to go back and cross some of those out and put in the right things. This is really handy for doing this sort of job. It's one of the smallest little engineer squares I've ever seen, but for doing the lines along there, this works really well. I'm going to mark up the second panel, and then I'm going to trim those out, and then I'll probably have to stop for the night because it's getting a bit late, and I'm not sure my neighbours will appreciate all the hammering I'd have to do. So we'll get to that stage anyway. It's the next day now, and I'm allowed to make noise again. I've attached the brass hinge pin to the first panel. Now there's two ways you can do this. You can either put the two panels together and wrap the hinge around all at once, which is how I did it the last time. But I found that quite tricky to stop the two panels moving in relation to each other. So this time what I've tried to do is put the pin into the top panel first, make sure all these gaps and things are all nice and this is all straight, and then I will insert the lower panel like this into the hinge. So it's going to need a little bit of a tap to get it in there, because these need to sort of curve a little bit to get underneath there. But you can see now how that all goes together. So that bottom panel is now in place. I found spraying it with some WD-40 just to help lubricate everything made it slot in there pretty well, and I actually had to use the hammer and sort of just tap it along this back edge to get the fingers to go into place there. And I'm just making sure that I've got this absolutely level, so I'm sort of making sure this is completely parallel all the way along and with a nice gap. The gap between these two panels here on the other side should be quite narrow. On the last one I did, I had about, it was like 1/8 of an inch gap between the panels, and on this one I want it to be much tighter. So with this in place now, I'll probably start in the middle, start folding these around and hammering them in place. One of the tools that's really useful for doing this are these sort of pliers I made. Get it to focus on those. These were sort of cheap nippers that I ground the ends, and the way I can use these is to crimp the aluminium around the pin like that. This works really well. So, and I can use this to sort of tighten these up. Now one thing is when you hammer these fingers around, sometimes they do move, so where the corner is kind of changes. But once you've got it around, you can sort of adjust that. You can knock these backwards and forwards, and the positioning of the pin sort of moves. The aluminium will sort of roll to where it needs to go. So obviously this one hasn't been trimmed to length yet, but I'll hammer those fingers over and we'll see what we have. I know this film is getting made of all sorts of little bits just tacked together, but I keep finding important little details that are worth showing. So this is how I actually fold these over. Again, I've got the problem of you have to lift them up. So I use the chisel to get underneath the corner there just to lift these up. And then my little spatula thing, I can prise them up. Once you've got them up enough, you can then put the dolly, I use my comma dolly, up hard against the hinge, and then I use my little plastic mallet to knock it round. Once I've got it all the way down on top of this, that's when I can start using my little crimping pliers I made here. So now the two halves of the bonnet together, and the hinge pin is in, and it works. So you can see this style of pin gives you quite a bit of motion there on the bonnet. Excuse the fact that it's filthy. It's I really need some brake cleaner or something to clean all this up, but I don't have any. I ran out of that weeks ago. I may end up taking it outside and just hosing it down with a bit of degreaser. But if we look on the other side, you can see that line there is fairly tight and fairly straight. It's almost a little bit too tight. I won't know until I've got it on the car, but you can adjust that a little bit by hammering the hinges backwards and forwards a little. But I think once that's on the car, that should look okay. I can't actually test this one on the car because this is the near side panel and it won't fit because the exhaust is in the way at the moment. So I need to do the second one and then we'll have a look at how that fits. So the final step before putting this back together and putting it on the car, although I have already had it on the car because you need to do that to mark it out, is trim the sides, which I've done, and I decided I would fold over the bottom edge. One, because it makes it far more rigid, and two, it just finishes it off so much better and it makes it a lot nicer to handle. So remember, people are going to be lifting this up. There'll be little finger pull handles on the other side, but you end up rubbing your fingers along that bottom edge a lot. Might need a little bit of smoothing out. It's a little bit rough on the inside there, but it's okay. Nobody sees the inside. So theoretically, if I've done this right, this should now be a rectangle. So go from there to there. It's 8 inches. There to there. And that's 8 inches. So that's now a perfect rectangle. So I'll do the other one and then we'll put them on the car and see what they look like. To get them on the car so I could measure things up, I did actually have to take off the inlet and exhaust manifold, which are both on the same side on this car. So I had to unbolt all that, so the car won't be running for a little while until I fix that, but at least it'll have a bonnet. That's the bonnet sides done. The bonnet still needs a little bit of a tweak to the shape of it. There's not quite enough curve just in here, which is why it's not sitting flat at the moment, but you can see when it pulls down, it all sits flat and flush, which is quite nice. Same on the other side. It just needs a little bit more curve through the middle here. You can sort of tell by if you push in the middle, it sort of flattens it all out to where it's supposed to be. And you can see how these work now. So there's the hinge line, and I got that fairly tight, almost maybe a little bit too tight, although the panel is flat so it's not too tight, but there's not much gap there. And then you can see as you lift the bonnet up, this whole panel folds down out of the way, so it gives you very good access to the engine. As I said, I had to take off the manifold and the carburetors, or the carburetor, there's only one, because the exhaust was coming out the side. So the next thing will be change the exhaust to make it come out and go down and under the car. But yeah, you can see how this folded edge on the bottom keeps everything really nice and tight, and the hinge doesn't look too bad. It just comes down again like that. This is the guard sort of blocked up where it's going to go. It's got a twist to it because it's not sitting on anything much at the end except an axle stand. So when you mount the headlights, you have to mount them far enough forwards that you don't clobber the back of them with the edge of the bonnet all the time. So I think that's come out reasonably well. I think it's straight, more or less. So yeah, next job is the exhaust. Tweak the curve on the bonnet just to get it to sit flat. That just means taking it off again, which is just a bit of a pain. It's just annoying taking it off and putting it on. And then front guards. So add the little bit at the back, box off the end so I can bolt it onto there, and then make the brackets that hold the front on, which will come up off these mounting points down here, and then the headlights will mount to those, and then screen, I guess. And I think that's more or less it, apart from all the little catches and things that straps go on and bits and pieces like that, lights at the rear, headlights, that kind of thing. But we're definitely getting there.